Thank you so much, Ben, and thank you to all the speakers. We have about 20 minutes of discussion time here, and I want to encourage folks to ask questions to all the speakers in the chat room, and we will get to each of the questions. Maybe I will start with a question to Ben. Myself, in the very last slide, you had that footnote that the cell quality and characterization or analytics was not considered in that last piece of model of cost and efficiency and automation. We talked a lot about in the earlier sessions about cell quality and CQAs and all that. What is your thought process on how that variable or parameter is going to influence this supply chain system and the automation system in the manufacturing pipeline? Could you hear that?
Yes, yeah. For a moment, my audio sort of went down. Okay. I think from a manufacturing standpoint, before we automate, and we want to standardize, okay, and then before we standardize, we want to simplify it. Okay, so those are the three stages leading up to the automation. So the first one is we need to understand the process variables and also the critical quality attributes and find out their relationship and interplays, and then simplify the process as much as we can. Okay, and then the second one is to standardize it. And once we have standardized the systems and we remove most of the uncertainties out of the system, and then we try to automate. Okay, I think it is a risky proposition to jump into automation right from the get-go without simplifying, without understanding the variabilities, and without standardizing the operations.
Great. So the next question is from Chris Saha, and I think I'm going to throw this to all the participants here. Maybe we can start with the Novartis team and then go down to Teresa and anyone else, Ben, if you want to comment. So the question is, what are some of the challenges on the horizon with respect to data storage, processing, and sharing for these methods, in particular in translational settings when working with patient samples? And we have had bits and pieces of this discussion throughout the workshop. So maybe Seshu or Aya, any of you want to start with that?
Yes, I am living that on a daily basis. So obviously, so there's multiple ways you can look into it. We have to make sure we are following HIPAA for the US, the EU regulations for EU, and each region has their own regulations. Novartis itself has their own internal regulations before you can look at any clinical trial data. So we are in a good position that way. And then after applying the Novartis considerations, we still take a look at, is it still okay for us to then store it in an environment that is still Novartis owned, but still it is external to wherever the clinical trial data is being stored. So what we do for that is we do something called anonymization of the data, wherein we want to remove as much as patient identifiers as we can. In certain instances, we may not be able to completely remove all columns that relate to the patient, in which case then we figure out how to control access to that particular column and who has access to that, so that at a later point in time, if we need to link between different databases, there are certain elements that we cannot get rid of. So then we call them pseudonymized variables and have documentation around that to say this is needed. We cannot live if we take this out. So this is the process we are following. And then we have compliance. After doing all of this, we have compliance checks on our end, compliance checks on the other department end, just to make sure that we are taking care of patient protection as much as we can.
Aya, do you have anything to add to that? No,
I think Seshu covered it really well, but that is one of the big challenges with all of this, because as we want to do these more sophisticated machine learning approaches, we need a way to aggregate and learn from the data and have those feedback loops. And in no way is it solved. And I think there's particular challenges as well when you're trying to do this manufacturing process within the context of a company that, as Sesha said, has to follow all kinds of compliance around this.
Yeah. And there is a related question before I move to the other speakers on this question. I think one of the question was whether the data that you all are handling can be shared to others outside of Novartis. And obviously you already outlined some of the challenges to that. And as you answer that question, we had a discussion with FDA yesterday, and Amy Abernethy was the principal deputy commissioner, and we talked a little bit about registries and the role of registries. I mean, obviously the post-market Kimbria data is getting deposited to the CIBMTR database, but it doesn't really come with the manufacturing and characterization data. So what do you all see from a big pharma perspective, where a community participation might be helpful, and is that even possible? And whether registries have a role to play in this data and modeling space.
What was the first part of the question, Krishnendu?
So the first part was whether the data you all are using can be available outside of Novartis. And the second part was whether registries have a play in terms of de-anonymized data and manufacturing data.
So I'll start with the second one, and then we'll slowly go to first, and then because then I'll segue it to IAM. Yeah. So registry, there's a difference between the registry data and the clinical trial data. Clinical trial data is a much more complete data set as opposed to registry. Yeah. Second is registry is not mandated in the US, so it depends upon physicians' voluntary effort to say, we are going to, input this information. Third thing with registry is that and this is for a physician to comment, but I'll tell you what I have taken from it. If the patient is doing well, then a lot of times they do not report back. So if you don't get any data, you don't know the actual situation. So in certain patients, we have 6 months, 9 months, 12 months. In certain, we'll have 6 and then maybe 12, certain with 12 and then 24. We are going to figure out how to overcome that gap because we are in that process right now because it took us some time to figure out the whole pseudonymization and everything. So that's from a registry perspective. As to sharing all of this, we will need partnerships, we'll need collaborations, we'll need a lot more back and forth contract signatures and what have you. Would never say, no is not the answer, but, Aya, do you want to take that question?
Actually, not so much because it is a complicated thing, but I wanted to add to the registry side, which you asked sort of what role they could play. I think a very important role, actually. So, and even some of this goes to the data sharing, right? So, I mean, from a compliance standpoint, there might be some data that we can share and others we can. And overall, our position is to do what we can to advance patient care. And that is what we'll do within sort of compliance. But I think the registries can play a very important role because I do think there's an important link between the manufacturing process and how the patients respond and how they respond over time, right? And I see the registry being a common place where we can bring in the data modalities from those two pieces together so that because this isn't just treat the patient once, right? We have to keep the monitoring going. And if we can pull those two together and actually understand the linkage between manufacturing and long-term outcomes, then we can generate these algorithms that get to the heart of what the patients and the doctors really need to know. And that will require, to your point about sharing the bigger picture, collaboration between the pharma companies and the clinicians and the patient groups, really to make that happen. And one last thing, just to advocate for registries and how we think about it, I worked very closely with the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation, and they have this amazing registry on multiple myeloma patients that they followed longitudinally over time, which now I'm sure this was about a year ago, but now probably has even some data coming from these kinds of novel cell therapies as well. And we're able to learn all kinds of things about the patients, predicting their disease progression, who was at high risk, who wasn't. And these algorithms are to everybody's benefits. It's not just for one part of the ecosystem, but it's really for all of us. Yeah.
Thank you. Maybe Teresa, from a data scientist person, how do you see what do you see the challenges and barriers for someone like you in accessing data, especially clinical patient data, and what do you think are the importance of democratizing data?
Well, obviously, even just with our we annually are having the discussion of access to the appropriate clinical data for the areas that we're examining. And so, one, I'm happy to hear the work that's being done at Novartis, and particularly the context of looking at the long-term effects and how are we actually going to be able to integrate the knowledge that we have on the manufacturing side of the long-term effects in a way that we can meaningfully share the appropriate data and then deepen our understanding on what actions we can take. I think particularly for, there's incredible power with what's being put in place with CMAT, but we absolutely have to have access to the clinical data that's in relation to the programs. And so those partnerships are paramount for us to really see the full potential of what's possible.
And there was a related question for you from Ross Henderson, asking whether the evolutionary computing simulations that you discussed, are there open source sources for that, or are there proprietary sources for that?
Okay. Well, the tools that and the results that I shared were a data modeler tool that actually our company has the software for that. So that's a licensed software. It's a desktop tool that you can easily implement. There are evolutionary algorithms obviously available. I think many in their platform of machine learning have them. One of the challenges, of course, are those that are open source can not always be the most efficient, and there aren't always constraints around overfitting. And so you have to take all of that into account in the choice of the tools that you're using.
And I just want to add one thing to Teresa's
Go
point.
ahead.
Okay, there's sufficient algorithms out there in the public domain and the publications that it really does come down to now having someone who's expert in the machine learning approaches paired with the right clinical expert or the manufacturing expert to really understand what is the fundamental of the problem. Given those fundamentals, what's the right underlying mathematics? And you said it so well around understanding the, how do you want to deal with noise and uncertainty with ensembles, for example, given the data. And then you can tailor the algorithm to address that and hopefully learn the signals that are really coming from the data and come up with good ways to test it. So we have all of those components today to do this.
That's great. Great to hear. A quick question for Ben here. One of the question is, what do companies, in your experience, look for or try to optimize? And it could be in the regenerative medicine space, if you do have that answer, or the broader spaces that you all have worked with in terms of relocation. When they're trying to relocate, are there optimization and modeling tools that you all have developed before or now that can help? So I believe I understood that question correctly.
Sure. I think there are two sets of questions the companies are looking for. And one set is tangible, meaning you can use existing models, to look at different scenarios, configurations, and compare the pros and cons. So that's one set. And the other set is really less tangible. So you have to look at, one is the labor, the workforce. If you have a skilled workforce, you look at the regulations, you look at the investment, and then you look at the infrastructure, transportations, and so forth. So I think there are two sets of variables companies often look for when they try to relocate to a different position.
And how does the supply chain fits into that?
I think the initial investment, the capex, so that's one set, and then the long term, like the variable costs, including the labors, and including the logistics, storage, distributions, and access to the ports and the airport and highway systems.
It's a different level of systems thinking, of course.
If I may just add, the relocation is with respect to relocating a facility?
Yes. Relocating facilities or adding facilities or getting into a new market, all of that.
Right. See, getting into a new market you can do with your existing facility, but relocating a facility is a huge hurdle.
Yeah.
And what Ben pointed out, I think the trained operators is the biggest and hardest commodity, right? So if you don't have them, then it's very difficult. Yeah. So while you can think about relocating, I think you need to invest, you need to make sure you plan it out such that you know the timelines you're looking for. It would be in the matter of years, not in the matter of months. Yeah. What happens by that time, your process would have changed, so you would have learned something new, and you would need to figure out how to include that. Then that means another filing. So the cycle goes on. Yeah. The cell and gene field is moving so much faster than the mammalian cell culture field that it's very hard to keep up with new technologies coming up and the process that's filed, right? So a commercial process that's filed is an old process, and you file it today. By the time you're filing it, it is redundant at times, right? So just keep all of that at the back of your mind. It's a huge challenge.
That's fantastic to know, because we will spend the next session talking about workforce development and training. So it would be a great segue. Yeah. I have two more questions that want to complete in this next 5 minutes here. The first one is from Sui Huang. For the Novartis team. Thanks for the presentation. It seems Novartis is building a system for using AI to extract from big data the actionable insights. You mentioned automatic insights from data and getting at causation from data. But do you think that something big is missing? The actual biological knowledge as only mastered by the human scientific mind. This would add meaning and mechanism to causation. Is your philosophy to skip that or rely on AI? Yeah. Or are you merging that?
Yeah. So our philosophy is not to skip that, but it is to use the measures, and the measures can be biological, right? What are we seeing on the cell viability, like flow data? It could come from gene expression and omic, and there's also process measures, right? And the whole thing constitutes a system, but we take sort of a probabilistic machine learning approach to this. So given the data now, yes, there might be this key node that says really what's going to drive, cell count. The amount of cell count that I get is this genome. And let's say in my first instantiation of the data, I don't really have that genome measured, but let's use what we know about how we can account for maybe hidden confounding or probabilistic models that still allow us in a probabilistic way to capture the effect. But guess what? We may need to still go back and get more data. And that's why your whole question about registries versus manufacturing and whatnot, can we combine these kinds of data modalities so that we can get to underlying biological mechanisms, which we know interact with process mechanisms?
You're on mute, Krishnendu.
You're on mute.
Thank you. Somehow trying to tab to the question, press the mute button. So the last question comes from Kimberly, and she's asking, today, do we have enough patient data, both product characterization data as well as outcome data that will allow us to predict treatment success? And how do companies get access to electronic health record data to perform process improvement? Is it clinical trial data that is more important, and does it include long-term durability data? So it's a multi-pronged question and probably a complex question. Maybe who wants to take that? Maybe Seshu, you guys probably have the most experience on that, and then
I don't want to overcrowd this session with answers. If somebody else wants to go before me, by all means.
Yeah. Anyone else? Okay, you go ahead, and then we will ping Teresa on that.
There were lots of questions, right? It's like a thesis. So let's just quickly the one or two.
Yeah, so maybe the most important is, do you think we have enough patient data, both product
yeah.
side and outcome.
So we have, in terms of clinical trials, our number of rows are so much smaller than the variables that we have. So that's a huge challenge, right? And then we use the clinical trial data set to maybe train the registry data. So no, we don't have that many patient information. So we need to take a look at two things. AI and machine learning needs tons of data. And cell and gene is in its infancy so far, right? So cell and gene, whatever data we have, and some of our companies are the most advanced, right? So, and we are saying there's a lot of limitation in the data that we have. From that, then you look into registry. So it's as many patients that we have supplied so far is the data set that we have. From that, you got regional registries, right? Each registry has their own regulation, and then it's voluntary. So we will not get back all the information we want from a clinical outcome perspective. We have to live with what we get. So in terms of, is there enough patient information? From my experience, from our experience, not enough. So we have to figure how to overcome that challenge. And that's like a minimal machine learning model. Can we do that? Can we apply that? Where do we see as a gap? And then what do we do to overcome that gap?
Yeah.
Aya, do you want to add something to that?
I think you said it very well.
Yeah.
But others would love to hear from you.
Teresa, I think you have talked about this, and other sessions have discussed about this low and expensive data rather than large and big data in the CNGT space. How do you, as a data science person, see that?
Well, I really draw from other experiences in the chemical and biologics arena, where we often have the situation where you may have a relatively low end and a lot of potential input variables. So that's really what drove our exploiting the symbolic regression capability to be able to utilize it to at least compress down to the highest probabilistic variables and variable combinations, and utilize that, if you will, as the hypothesis generator, versus a lot of the more traditional machine learning tools are very, very dependent on very high end, and they're utilizing it for feature identification and then that type of training, versus being able to have these explicit inputs that you can take back to the domain expert and say, okay, does this make sense? And begin to build and test from that. So you can utilize that framework to actually design that next set of validation, rather than waiting for the large end to arrive to drive those conclusions.
And I was at some point at a talk from the CEO of Intel, and they were saying how they have these process models. And even after 20 years of chip making, every run they do, the data goes back to the model to learn more and improve the model. So we in CG&T are far from that. And other industries have done that, though. So I think there is a lot of learning opportunities from the more matured industries, manufacturing industries.
Well, that's why I brought up the topic of informatics. Isn't always the sexiest topic, but the reality is, and I'm sure what's happening at Novartis and GSK and others, is a huge amount of the effort is really thinking about the structure of the informatics in a way that it can be reutilized across the enterprise for various decisions. And then you have, of course, the confounding issues of patient protection and all that was very well articulated earlier, that becomes a big challenge. But nonetheless, the investment up front of really thinking about the power of reusing data. People have to think of data as an asset, just as they think of the physical assets that are in the building and their human assets. The data is the most unexploited asset within most corporations today.
And right. Just to add to that one thing, right? Yeah. Insights are great, right? But in a filed process, in a regulated process, what do we do with this new insight, and how do I input that into my already validated process is another huge time sink and a challenge. Something to,
And I think we will leave it at that, but we did have a discussion with the FDA in this process is the product. Is that the right thinking in CG&T, or is it product, the product, and the process can vary to get to that product? And that's an evolution that regulators need to have. With that, I think we are a little over time. We have about 15 minutes of break before we come back to the most important topic of workforce training. As we learned throughout the 2 days, that's a very important point. So we'll take a break now and we'll be back at 1:20. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.